Good morning. It's a bit of a job getting oneself presentable. It's more work than I'm willing to do every day, but special times call for special measures, right? And even then, still only with mixed results. But don't worry, soon I'll be able to get a haircut, and then everything will be good, right? So we're talking about spiritual disciplines these days, and Michael's talked about a few of them already, and when he first talked about doing a series on spiritual disciplines, my heart kind of sank because I thought that's I'm the last person that should be talking about spiritual disciplines. Um, if it would depend completely on my own experience, I'd say you should rather let somebody else preach. And yet, Michael wanted me to preach one of them, and so I consented, knowing full well that I'm the least qualified probably to talk about spiritual discipline. Not because I don't think spiritual disciplines are a good thing. I do, but they're just not really my cup of tea. I'm not a disciplined person. I remember when I was a kid, quite young, learning the fruits of the Spirit. I learned them in the King James Version: love, joy, peace, long suffering, gentleness, goodness, faith, meekness, and temperance. And I liked that list until I found out what temperance meant. I at first I thought it was just like temperance that had to do with drinking, right? And I didn't drink, and I didn't expect that I ever would. So that wasn't an issue until I started using other translations and found out that temperance was self-control or self-discipline, and then I felt kind of like, oh shoot, there goes that nice list. So if I'm talking about spiritual disciplines today, and particularly about fasting, but it'll be mostly me talking about ideas rather than sharing with you my wealth of knowledge or my wealth of experience, because this is something that I should be the one listening, not the one talking. I'm still a little uncomfortable preaching to my camera. It feels kind of awkward to me. So I'm gonna take a bit of a different approach here. We haven't been able to sit and visit with each other for a long time, so I'm going to pretend that I'm just sitting and visiting with you here in what we call Grandma's place, and you're sitting across the way from me, and the conversation has turned to spiritual things, and you've asked me about spiritual disciplines, and so I'm going to try and respond to that question. My first response is my heart sinks because I'd kind of been hoping to get through life without having to answer that question, because, like I've already mentioned, I'm not a disciplined person. I like the idea of self-discipline, and I admire people who are very self-disciplined, who have rigorous routines that they follow. They exercise regularly. They eat only good food, and they have a regular quiet time, and they study, and they pray, and do all these good things in a very, very structured way. And I like I say, I admire people like that, but that doesn't describe me, not even a little bit. I am not a structure it's hardly in my vocabulary. And so I love doing these things. I love studying the Word. I love praying. I love memorizing, but I don't to try and to call it discipline. The way I approach it would be to stretch the definition of discipline. And so, like I already mentioned, I'm going to talk about some of these ideas from my own study of the Bible, and maybe a little bit of Christian history and so on, but not I can't say like Paul did, follow me, as I follow Christ, because, like I said, I should be the one listening, not the one talking. So the particular spiritual discipline we're talking about today is fasting. And that word used to scare me, because the thought of going without food, I used to have a higher metabolism than I do now, and so going without food was a real challenge. I did experiment with fasting some when I was younger, and I wish I could say that I always felt like really spiritual, and that I always felt like it was a good thing, and that I always felt like I had good results. But I can't honestly say that fasting has those times of fasting were spiritual highlights for me. And I've done some fasting, even fairly recently, and it's always, first of all, it's hard to get one's motivations right when you're trying to keep your weight in check. It's easy to start weighing yourself and seeing if it's making a difference and stuff, and then you get your motivation mixed up, and so fasting for purely spiritual reasons, that's a bit of a challenge, at least for someone like me, who wouldn't mind the side benefit of losing some weight in the process. And I've been doing some research on fasting too, and it is actually a healthy discipline by itself, even if you take away any possible spiritual implications. And fasting has been part of human civilization for as long as anybody knows, and it's probably partly because the cycles of life. It used to be we didn't have freezers and fridges and stuff, so people had to eat when there was food to eat, and when there wasn't food, then they would go hungry until there was food again. And so it became a fairly natural rhythm. And so when the Bible talks about fasting, it was just pretty much a normal accepted thing. People just knew that fasting was a normal part of life, and so they made it part of their spiritual life to include fasts, feasts and fasts, and that kind of reflects the natural cycles of life. And so one of the questions that comes up pretty quickly when you talk about fasting is, should Christians be fasting at all? Most religions have, even some Christian denominations have fasting as part of their religion. The Muslims practice Ramadan, and I haven't studied other religions much, but I know that fasting is partly because that's just been a normal experience for people historically. Probably it's become part of every religious practice to have some kind of fasting, and the Catholic Church practices fasting. The monks and so on, that fasting would have been a pretty normal part of their lives. And we've talked about Lent sometimes. Lent would have been a time of fasting, if not going without food completely, at least occasionally, or restricting themselves from certain good foods that they really enjoyed. And so it was a time of self-denial. And so we wonder, should we as evangelical 21st century Christians include fasting in our repertoire of spiritual disciplines? And the New Testament, well, some would say it's very clear about fasting, because Jesus, in the Sermon on the Mountain, he talked about fasting as if it was something that Christians would, of course, do. When you fast, he said, and then he talked about how we should approach fasting. And it was something that, you remember the time they asked Jesus, why don't your disciples fast? The disciples of the Pharisees and John's disciples all fast. Why didn't his disciples fast? And Jesus said they can't fast while the bridegroom was with them, but there is a time coming when they will fast. And sure enough, in Acts we see that they were fasting before they chose Paul Paul and Barnabas to go on their missionary journey, they were praying and fasting, and so it comes up quite naturally in the church practice in the early days, and Jesus talked about it as if it would be a normal part of church practice. So I think we can safely say that fasting, while it's not strictly prescribed, it is certainly something that we can count as being normal for Christians to fast. That fasting would be an acceptable and normal part of our spiritual discipline. So the next question comes up: why do we fast, or what do we hope to accomplish when we fast? And I've always found that a little bit of a tricky question, because I'm not quite sure. I'm not really quite sure why fasting. I know in the Bible it talks about fasting like in times of sorrow. And if you think of fasting as a counterpart of feasting, then we would fast when we are expressing our sorrow or our even our repentance and so on. But there's that place, I think it's in Psalms, where it says, how can we sing the Lord's song in a strange land? And it's kind of that idea of how can we celebrate when we are experiencing such deep sorrow. And so fasting I think it's connected with sorrow. Just like Jesus said, when the bridegroom's with you, you don't fast. But when the bridegroom is taken away, then you fast. And so I think it has something to do with an expression of what's going on inside us, what we're going through. We fast to express our sorrow. I think John Piper calls fasting an intensifier. That's another way of looking at it. Maybe like Jesus said when the disciples couldn't cast out that demon, he said, this kind comes out only with prayer and fasting. It's almost like fasting adds that extra element of urgency to your prayers. I heard another, or I think it was something I read this week. The guy said, do you never want a prayer answered so badly that you wouldn't be willing to miss a meal to have it answered? Or is there, I think the way he said it was, is there nothing you want more than you want to eat lunch? And I thought that puts a good perspective on it. It is a way of showing how serious you are. I mean, God reads our hearts, and so he probably doesn't need us to fast to prove to him how serious we are, but maybe it does even more for us, proving to ourselves that we really mean it when we're praying. There's that place where Jesus talks about fasting in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 6. He talks about doing it in secret. And I think that's a big principle about spiritual disciplines. Anyway, one of the reasons I hesitate to talk about them is because Jesus, there's three spiritual disciplines he brings up in the Sermon on the Mount, at least in that chapter 6 there, praying and fasting and giving. And all three of them, he says, when you do these things, do it in secret. And then the thing that I wanted to add was, he also says, then your Father who sees what is in heaven, who sees what is done in secret, will reward you. And I find that interesting. What does that mean? He will reward you when he sees what you do in secret. It's an interesting thought. So there is something to it. He says, when you fast, do it in secret, so when your Father in heaven sees what is done in secret, he will reward you. So there is something to it, that fasting accomplishes something, and that there is some kind of reward to it, whether that's a reward of an answered prayer or a reward that will only be realized in heaven when the rewards are distributed. It remains to be seen. I can't tell you what exactly that means. So we fast to express our sorrow. We fast to lend some gravity, maybe is a good word, to our praying. It's kind of a supplement, maybe, to praying. There's also, I mentioned that verse, how can we sing this Lord's song in a strange land? And we, when we really identify with someone, we in their suffering, we want to take some of that suffering on ourselves. And there's Paul talks about it quite a bit in part about partaking in the sufferings of Christ. And Jesus himself fasted 40 days in the wilderness. And Romans chapter 8 verse 17 talks about our adoption, if indeed we share in his suffering. Some of these things are contingent on us sharing in the sufferings of Christ. And in Romans chapter 6 it says we were buried with him and raised with him. And there are other places, in Colossians 1 verse 24, I can't claim to understand what he means here even. He says, now I rejoice in that I am suffering for you, and I fill up in my flesh what is still lacking in regard to Christ's afflictions for the sake of his body, which is the church. There's something about suffering that Paul makes it sound like it's an integral part of the Christian life. And I think that fasting may even be one way of suffering with Christ. And that's a very incomplete thought, but it's something worth exploring. Someday I want to dig into that further and see if I can figure, because it's puzzled me for a long time, and I think you probably see it in almost every one of his epistles, talking about suffering, partaking in the suffering of Christ. So there's that. And when I think about fasting, I feel like we have to go beyond fasting. And I kind of did that already when I talk about partaking in the sufferings of Christ. I think when Jesus called his disciples, he said, deny yourself, take up your cross, and follow me. And I think that's kind of what fasting is a way of demonstrating that we're denying ourselves. We're taking up our cross and following him. Jesus was a man of sorrows. He was acquainted with grief. And so fasting makes sense in that context. In Matthew 16:24, if anyone would come after me, he must deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. And that shows up in all three of the synoptic gospels. So I want to stretch this out beyond just fasting. I want to talk about denying ourselves. And we do, one of the reasons we deny ourselves is for the sake of others. Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians chapter 8, chapter 8 and 9 and even chapter 10 of 1 Corinthians really builds on this theme. In chapter 8 verse 9, he says, be careful, however, that the exercise of your freedom does not become a stumbling block to the weak. He's talking about people eating food that's sacrificed to idols, and he goes so far as to say that if my freedom in this area is going to cause somebody to stumble, then I would rather not eat meat the rest of my life than cause a weaker brother to stumble. Therefore, if what I eat, verse 13, causes my brother to fall into sin, I will never eat meat again, so that I will not cause him to fall. So Paul takes it pretty seriously, and so that he is willing to fast of meat never eat meat again, which is fasting for the sake of somebody else. In chapter 9, verse 12, he's talking about as an apostle, he would have had the right to receive income from being an apostle. And yet in chapter 9, verse 12, he says, but we did not use this right. On the contrary, we put up with anything rather than hinder the gospel of Christ. Again, he's talking about what he's willing to sacrifice for the sake of others and for the sake of the gospel. And then he continues in verse 19 of 1 Corinthians chapter 9. He says, though I am free and belong to no man, I make myself a slave to everyone, to win as many as possible. To the Jews, I became like a Jew to win the Jews. To those under the law, I became like one under the law, though I myself am not under the law, so as to win those under the law. To those not having the law, I became like one not having the law, though I am not free from God's law, but am under Christ's law, so as to win those not having the law. To the weak, I became weak to win the weak. I have become all things to all men, so that by all possible means I might save some. I do all this for the sake of the gospel, that I may share in its blessings. And I've heard this passage used to excuse Christians who want to try and fit into their culture. I become all things to all men, and so they do all kinds of things to try and fit into their culture, including questionable practices or living just like their neighbors. And that's not at all what Paul is talking about here. He's talking about the things he's willing to sacrifice for the sake of others. To the weak, I became weak. To those under the law, I became as one living under the law. And to me, that is like fasting. You're fasting from your own rights. There's another place in Galatians where he says, "You, my brothers, were called to be free, but do not use your freedom to indulge the sinful nature. Rather, serve one another in love." The entire law is summed up in a single command: love your neighbor as yourself. You see the connection I'm trying to make here? I'm not sure how clear I'm being. Fasting is kind of demonstrating that we're giving up our right. We have the right, I suppose, to eat regularly if we have lots of food available to us. And yet we are showing the world, we're showing God that we're not hanging on to our rights. We are willing to sacrifice the way Jesus was willing to sacrifice, the way Paul was willing to sacrifice. And one of the reasons we do that is because we love our neighbor. We would give up good things if it's for the benefit of others. And so fasting isn't directly, I don't know how you would ever fast to directly help somebody else, but it's a way of practicing self-denial, which we are called to do for the sake of others. Although I just thought, as I was saying that, I thought of how we would, when we were involved with the youth, we would do these 30-hour or 40-hour famines. So that would involve some fasting. I think we made it a little more fun than maybe it was meant to be, but there we are. That was a way of identifying with people who had less food, and it was a way of making ourselves more aware of what life was like for others and sacrificing that in order to raise awareness and hopefully maybe even raise some money for people who are less fortunate. So that's maybe not a bad example to bring in here. And having said that, I think we have to almost automatically remind ourselves that this can't become a religious duty, or we don't do it for religious reasons. We don't do it to prove to God how serious we are, or hope that He will give us some kind of points, or that we can somehow earn our salvation, or maybe a better spot in heaven when we get there because we are so religious that we fast. I mentioned Galatians 5 verse 13, but a little bit before that he said Galatians 5 verse 1, he said, "It is for freedom that Christ has set us free. Stand firm then, and do not let yourselves be burdened again by a yoke of slavery." It's so easy for us to think, oh, fasting is a good thing. I'm going to make that part of my religion. I've talked about this before, about how traditions are designed to help us in our spiritual life. But if we are serving the tradition rather than the tradition serving us, then we've got it the wrong way around, and it's losing its effectiveness. And that same thing can happen with fasting. If we do it as a ritual, or it just becomes a religious thing, then we're missing out, I think. And there's another place where Paul, in that same discussion where he's talking about giving up the eating of meat, "For why should my freedom be judged by another man's conscience? If I take part in the meal with thankfulness, why am I denounced because of something I thank God for?" And that ties right into something he says in 1 Timothy chapter 4. The Spirit clearly says that in later times some will abandon the faith and follow deceiving spirits and things taught by demons. Such teachings come through hypocritical liars, whose consciences have been seared as with a hot iron. They forbid people to marry and order them to abstain from certain foods, which God created to be received with thanksgiving by those who believe and who know the truth. For everything God created is good, and nothing is to be rejected if it is received with thanksgiving. So that's kind of the counterbalance to the whole religious problem. And that's maybe one of the reasons I talked at the beginning about how spiritual disciplines are not really my cup of tea. And maybe this is partly why, if I can excuse myself a little bit, because I'm always quite afraid of religion, of these things becoming religious rituals instead of them becoming something that we can benefit from doing from a sincere heart, and with the goal of benefiting from them and of growing closer to Jesus as a result. So it's time to wrap this up. I run out of time, and there's lots more that could be said, but I want to conclude. I think we need to think of fasting as a tool, something that we can use to express sorrow, and we can express the gravity of the thing that we are praying for, or the thing that is affecting us right at this time when we feel that we should be fasting rather than feasting. I probably should have elaborated on this a bit more, but it also, because fasting and praying is so closely linked, often when we're fasting, our hunger can remind us of why we're fasting. Every time we feel hungry, it can remind us to pray about that thing that we're praying about, and it can bring us back into focus. So maybe it can be a tool to use for focusing. And the other thought is, let's not do it for show. Jesus was very adamant about that, and let's not let it become empty religion. Other than that, fast, and God be with you. Let's pray. Lord, thank you that we can feast and rejoice, and we can fast and mourn, and that you are there listening and observing, and that you know our hearts, that you hear our prayers, and that you are with us in the good times and the bad times. We commit both and everything in between to you. Amen. Go with God.